Okay, let's unpack this. Think about those moments when you're puzzling something out, maybe your phone's acting weird, or, you're trying to understand why a friend did something, and you just feel drawn to the simplest explanation, like maybe the phone just needs an update, or your friend was just tired. That instinct, that mental shortcut towards the straightforward. Well, that's pretty much the core of what we're exploring today.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that this preference for simplicity isn't just like a modern gut feeling. It's actually a principle with really deep roots and surprising complexity. We're talking about Occam's Razor. It's a kind of problem-solving tool that suggests we should favor explanations with the fewest, let's say, moving parts. You might also hear it called the principle or law of parsimony. Those terms come from the Latin novacula occami and the lex parsimoniae.
Exactly. And while William of Occam, who was this brilliant 14th century English philosopher and theologian, while he's the one most famously associated with it, it's worth noting he didn't actually coin that catchy phrase, Occam's Razor, but his name stuck, right? Probably because he used the underlying idea so powerfully in his work.
That's right. I mean, the popular way people put it now is something like when you have two competing theories that explain the same thing equally well, go with the simpler one. But Occam himself, he phrased it in various ways, like numquam ponenda est pluralitas sine necessitate, which basically means plurality must never be posited without necessity. And actually, the version we hear most often today, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity, that came from an Irish philosopher, John Punch, in 1639. He called it a sort of common axiom among scholars back then.
Okay, so the fundamental idea is this. If you've got multiple explanations, and they all seem to fit the facts equally well, the one that relies on the fewest assumptions, that's generally the one to prefer.
It's like a guide, yeah.
For cutting away unnecessary complexity. Not really a way to decide between explanations that predict totally different things.
Exactly. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to peel back the layers of this, seemingly straightforward idea. We'll look at where it really came from, explore the reasons why simpler might actually be better sometimes. We'll see how it's used across a huge range of subjects, from science to philosophy, and even touch on some of the debates and controversies around it. By the end, you should have a much richer understanding of when and why this razor is such a, sharp tool for thinking.
Okay, so the name Occam's Razor itself, that didn't even pop up until, a couple of centuries after Occam lived? You said Liber Freudmann in 1649 first linked it to him.
That's right, quite a bit later. But as we kind of hinted, the core idea, this preference for simplicity, it wasn't exactly brand new with Occam. Not by a long shot.
So others were thinking along similar lines.
Oh, absolutely. Looking at the bigger picture, you see echoes of this idea stretching way, way back. Even before Occam, philosophers were sort of wrestling with this notion that simpler explanations often have an edge. Think about John Duns Scotus. He was around the same time as Occam, and he said something very similar. Plurality is not to be posited without necessity.
And even earlier thinkers were on this track, too.
Definitely. Robert Grosseteste in the 13th century put it like this: that is better and more valuable, which requires fewer, other circumstances being equal. And what's interesting is he saw this applying broadly, not just in one specific area. Maimonides, the really influential 12th century Jewish philosopher, also pushed for simpler explanations in his work. And if you go all the way back to ancient Greece, Aristotle himself, in his Posterior Analytics, suggested that the best demonstrations, the best proofs, come from the fewest possible assumptions or postulates.
Wow, it's kind of mind-blowing that this basic idea has been kicking around for so long in different forms.
It really is. And it wasn't just minor figures noticing this. Even Thomas Aquinas, in his massive Summa Theologica, he acknowledged that it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. What's really fascinating there is that Aquinas even used a version of this idea as part of an argument against the existence of God, although, of course, he then presented his counter-arguments.
So even thinkers who weren't necessarily like champions of what we now call Occam's Razor, they still recognized its internal logic.
Precisely, yeah. Fast forward a few centuries, and you get Isaac Newton. He articulated a very clear version of this, specifically for natural science. We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. His focus was really on sticking to what we can actually demonstrate and what's truly needed. This was a key shift, wasn't it? Moving away from just speculating about causes to focusing only on those necessary to explain what we actually observe. Kind of a cornerstone of the modern scientific method.
And Bertrand Russell, he had his own take, too, usually pretty sharp.
Yes, Russell, in his typical style, suggested, whenever possible, substitute constructions out of known entities for inferences to unknown entities. He was basically saying, look, let's build our explanations on solid ground, on things we already know, rather than just inventing new, unverified concepts if we can possibly avoid it.
Okay, so all of this is happening way before the 20th century. Has there been any attempt to put Occam's razor on a more, I don't know, formal mathematical footing in modern times?
Absolutely. Around the 1960s, Ray Solomanoff developed something called the theory of universal inductive inference. It's a bit abstract, but think of it like trying to predict the next word in a sentence. A simpler theory, or model of grammar, is generally more likely to correctly predict a wider range of future sentences than some overly complex one that only fits the specific examples you've seen so far. Solomanoff's work provides a mathematical way to think about prediction based on observations. It suggests simpler explanations are inherently more probable because they correspond to shorter descriptions or programs in a theoretical sense. Many see this as a kind of mathematical formalization of Occam's razor.
That does seem pretty abstract still. Are there more, maybe down-to-earth ways people think about this principle in modern science or other fields?
Oh, certainly. We also have the concept of ontological parsimony, sometimes just called the rule of simplicity. Essentially, this is about trying to keep the list of fundamental things or types of stuff we believe exist as short as possible. Like, why invent new kinds of entities if we can explain things perfectly well with the ones we already accept? Then there's Ernst Mach's principle of economy in physics. He argued for using the most straightforward descriptions based directly on what we can observe and cutting out anything unobservable or metaphysical. And in medicine, of course, there's the famous zebra heuristic. When you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras, which just means, favor the common, simpler diagnosis over some rare, complicated disease, at least initially.
Right. Start with the basics. Okay, so we've traced where this idea comes from, its long history, but the really big question is, why? Why should we actually prefer simpler explanations? What's the justification, the logic behind Occam's razor?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historically, like up until the 20th century, a lot of the justification was, maybe surprisingly, rooted in aesthetics and even theology. There was this widespread belief that nature itself was fundamentally simple, elegant, orderly. And so simpler explanations were thought more likely to actually reflect that underlying reality. Aquinas, for instance, argued something like, if a thing can be done adequately by means of one, it is superfluous to do it by means of several, for we observe that nature does not employ two instruments if one suffices. So a belief in an elegant, efficient universe played a pretty big role.
So it was almost like a feeling that the universe itself was kind of a minimalist designer.
Exactly, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But then in the 20th century, the justifications shifted much more towards epistemology, how we know what we know, and started incorporating ideas from induction, logic, pragmatism, and especially probability theory.
Okay, how does probability theory come into it? How does that support Occam's razor?
Well, one key idea from probability is that every single assumption you make in a theory adds a potential point of failure, right? So if an assumption doesn't actually improve the accuracy or the explanatory power of your theory, all it really does is increase the overall chance that your entire theory is wrong. It's a bit like saying the more complicated the machine, the more individual parts there are that could potentially break down.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. Yeah, more moving parts, more opportunities for something to go sideways.
Exactly. And then there's also the empirical track record of Occam's razor. The fact that, just looking back historically, simpler theories have often, though not always, led to more accurate predictions down the line. Think about the problem of overfitting in statistics or machine learning. Overly complex models can become too tailored to the specific data they were trained on, including all the random noise and quirks in that data. Then, when you try to use that complex model on new data, it performs poorly. Simpler models, by focusing on the more fundamental underlying relationships, often generalize better. They have better predictive power for the future.
So it's not just some philosophical hunch. There's actually some practical evidence suggesting that simplicity can be a good indicator of a useful, robust theory.
There is, yeah. And then there's the really practical side of things. For any phenomenon, you could theoretically invent an infinite number of increasingly complex and probably wrong explanations. You can always tack on what's called an ad hoc hypothesis. That's a specific justification you invent solely to prevent your main theory from being disproven by some inconvenient fact. The classic, slightly silly example is, say, the idea that leprechauns broke a vase. If someone challenges this by saying, well, nobody saw any leprechauns, you could just add the ad hoc hypothesis that, oh, these leprechauns are invisible, or they only come out at night when no one is watching, and so on and so on. Occam's razor helps us cut through those potentially endless layers of unnecessary, often untestable complexity. It helps keep us focused on the most likely and crucially testable explanations.
It sounds almost like a tool for intellectual hygiene then, keeping our explanations clean and focused, not letting them get cluttered with junk.
Precisely. That's a great way to think about it. And mathematically, as we touched on briefly, there are more formal underpinnings too. Bayesian model comparison, for example, provides a whole framework for weighing the complexity of a model against how well it actually explains the data we have. Concepts like the Akaike Information Criterion, AIC, and the Bayesian Information Criterion, BIC, are practical statistical tools that offer ways to penalize models for having too many parameters, essentially formalizing this preference for simplicity. So these are like actual mathematical tools that help researchers decide if adding more bells and whistles to a theory genuinely makes it better, or if it just makes it more complex, maybe more prone to error.
Okay. What about different philosophical perspectives? We talked about probability and practicality, but how do philosophers justify this preference for simplicity?
Yeah, there were several interesting angles. Karl Popper, for instance, linked simplicity very directly to falsifiability. The idea that a scientific theory must be testable and potentially provable wrong. He argued that simpler theories are actually preferable because they make broader, more easily testable claims. They're therefore easier to potentially disprove if they are wrong. The idea is that a simpler theory kind of exposes itself to more potential ways of being falsified. So it's riskier, in a good scientific way, more chances to be proven wrong, but also more potential to be broadly right if it survives those tests.
Right. It puts its neck on the line more. What about others?
Well, Elliot Sober, another philosopher of science, initially saw simplicity mainly as a form of informativeness. Simpler theories tell us more in a concise way. But he later refined his view, questioning whether simplicity has some inherent, automatic epistemic justification, meaning does it automatically make a theory more likely to be true without considering the specific context? So initially he thought simplicity was just inherently a sign of a better theory, maybe. But then he started wondering if maybe its value just depends on what we're trying to figure out in the first place.
Ah, that's a really important nuance, isn't it? It suggests the value of simplicity might not be universal, but might depend heavily on the specific questions we're asking and the kind of phenomena we're investigating.
Exactly. Richard Swinburne, on the other hand, argues quite strongly that simplicity is a fundamental a priori epistemic principle, basically a fundamental principle of knowledge. He believes that since the data alone often isn't enough to definitively force us to choose between competing theories that all fit the facts, we need simplicity as a basic guiding principle to lead us towards the most plausible truth among those options.
And even Wittgenstein, focusing on language and meaning, had something to say.
Yes, he had that famous line, "If a sign is not necessary, then it is meaningless." That is the meaning of Occam's razor. He sort of saw unnecessary complexity in our descriptions and symbols as just adding meaningless noise to the signal we're trying to convey.
Okay, so this razor isn't just some abstract idea philosophers argue about in ivory towers. It's actively used, right, as a practical tool across a huge number of different fields.
Absolutely. Let's start with science and the scientific method itself. Occam's razor acts as a really valuable heuristic, a kind of rule of thumb that scientists often use, sometimes implicitly, when they're developing theoretical models. It's maybe less of a strict law for deciding between already established theories, but it plays a pretty significant role in guiding the process of building new ones.
Can you give us some concrete examples, maybe, from physics, perhaps?
Sure. Think about the principle of least action. This states that the path taken by a physical system between 2 points is the one that minimizes a certain quantity called action. Parsimony, the drive for simplicity, played a significant role in the development and eventual acceptance of this very fundamental principle. Einstein's formulation of special relativity is another classic example. It provided a much simpler and more elegant explanation for phenomena related to light speed and motion that were becoming incredibly convoluted under the older models, like the idea of a luminiferous ether. And in the early, messy days of quantum mechanics, simplicity was also a guiding light, perhaps implicitly, for figures like Planck, Heisenberg, and de Broglie, as they tried desperately to make sense of the bizarre subatomic world.
Right. What about in other scientific disciplines, like chemistry?
In chemistry, Occam's razor is often a key consideration when scientists are trying to figure out the step-by-step mechanisms of chemical reactions. You generally aim for the model that involves the fewest intermediate steps and the fewest hypothetical, unobserved intermediate molecules. Although, and this is crucial, you have to remember that famous caution, often attributed to Einstein: everything should be kept as simple as possible, but not simpler. You can't sacrifice the ability to accurately represent the actual data just for the sake of having the most stripped-down explanation possible.
Right, you need to find that sweet spot where the explanation is as simple as it can be while still capturing all the essential details of what's actually happening.
Exactly that. And just thinking more broadly about the scientific method, this preference for simpler theories is very closely linked to that idea of falsifiability we mentioned earlier with Popper. Simpler theories tend to make more specific and therefore more easily testable predictions. Because they have fewer moving parts, there are fewer ways they can be sort of tweaked or adjusted after the fact to avoid being proven wrong by new data. However, and this is really vital to remember, science is a constantly evolving process. Future evidence might very well come along that supports a more complex theory over a currently simpler one. The razor is a tool for now, based on the best data we currently possess, not a crystal ball for all time.
It really sounds like the wisdom or even the possibility of applying this razor effectively really depends heavily on the specific context of what you're investigating.
Precisely. What counts as a useful level of simplicity in, say, particle physics might be completely inappropriate or even misleading in, say, ecology or sociology. It's definitely not a universal rule that applies in exactly the same way across all subjects.
Interesting. And it seems like there have probably been times when sticking too rigidly to a simple explanation actually held back scientific progress, maybe by causing resistance to new ideas that sounded more complex at first.
That's a really insightful point, and yes, absolutely. History is kind of littered with examples where seemingly simpler, established explanations were favored, sometimes stubbornly, over new ideas that, in retrospect, turned out to be correct. Think about the initial skepticism toward the idea of meteorites. Rocks falling from the sky seemed, to many at the time, much more complex and less plausible than finding purely terrestrial explanations for unusual stones found on the ground. The same goes for things like ball lightning, continental drift. The idea that entire continents moved seemed vastly more complex than assuming they were fixed. Even the discovery of reverse transcriptase in biology, which went against the established central dogma, seemed to add an unnecessary complication at first. And conversely, sometimes theories that initially seem more complex, like the atomic theory of matter or the idea that light propagates through a vacuum instead of some invisible physical ether, eventually became the simpler and more accepted explanations as more evidence came in. So yeah, it's definitely not a simple equation of simple equals correct.
Definitely not. Okay, let's turn our attention to biology then. Where does Occam's razor tend to pop up in the life sciences? It seems like a field where complexity often rules.
It does appear in several key areas, though often with caveats. Particularly notable are the ongoing debates about the units of selection and evolution, and also in the field of systematics, which deals with classifying organisms.
Units of selection, can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, that's the big debate about what level of biological organization natural selection primarily acts upon. Is it individual organisms fighting for survival? Is it groups competing? Or is it really all about the genes themselves, as Dawkins argued, or maybe even species selection over long timescales? George C. Williams, back in the 60s, famously argued that explaining apparently altruistic behavior in animals like warning calls or self-sacrifice through individual selection, focusing on the benefits to the individual's own genes, maybe through helping relatives, was more parsimonious explanation than invoking group selection, the idea that altruism evolves for the good of the whole group. He even cited something called Morgan's canon, which is a related principle in animal behavior, suggesting we shouldn't explain behavior using complex mental faculties if a simpler explanation based on basic learning or instinct will suffice. So explaining apparent altruism through basically selfish individual or gene-level benefits was seen as simpler than positing selection acting at the group level.
But that's not a universally accepted view, is it?
Yeah.
The whole group selection debate is still quite lively?
Not at all. It's very much debated. And thinkers like Richard Dawkins, with his selfish gene concept, argued that a gene-centric view might actually be the most fundamental and ultimately parsimonious explanation of all, with individual and even group selection just being emergent phenomena resulting from the underlying competition between genes. The classic example often used is musk oxen forming a defensive circle against predators. Is that group selection, protecting the herd? Is it kin selection, because they're mostly related and protecting shared genes? Or is it even just individual selection, because each individual muskox is personally safer inside the circle, regardless of the others? It's often really difficult to definitively tease out the simplest, most accurate explanation in complex biological scenarios.
It really highlights how tangled biological systems can be. What about in systematics, the classification side?
Right. In systematics, particularly in the method called cladistics, Occam's razor is applied quite explicitly through the principle of cladistic parsimony, or sometimes called maximum parsimony. This is a method used to build phylogenetic trees, those branching diagrams that show evolutionary relationships. The method favors the tree that requires the fewest number of evolutionary changes, like the appearance or disappearance of a specific trait, or a change in a DNA sequence to explain the observed differences between the species you're looking at. The assumption is that fewer evolutionary changes represent a more likely and thus simpler historical pathway.
So the evolutionary story that requires the fewest invented steps or changes is considered the most probable one.
That's the core idea, yeah. However, this approach has definitely faced its share of criticism. Some argue that under certain evolutionary conditions, it can be statistically inconsistent, meaning that as you gather more and more data, the method might actually become less likely to converge on the true evolutionary tree. You can get stuck on a wrong answer. But proponents of cladistic parsimony argue that this potential for inconsistency isn't necessarily unique to their method and that it often performs well in practice. It's still a widely used tool.
And are there any sort of general warnings about being too quick to apply Occam's razor in biology, given its complexity?
Absolutely. Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA structure, famously cautioned that while Occam's razor is a very valuable tool in the physical sciences, it can actually be quite dangerous if applied too simplistically in biology. His point was that biological systems are the product of millions of years of natural selection, which is a messy historical process. It doesn't necessarily engineer the most elegant or simplest mechanisms in the way a human designer might. Evolution often involves historical contingencies, trade-offs, and quirky solutions that result in complex rather than simple mechanisms. So forcing a simple explanation onto a biological system might actually cause you to miss the real, often quite intricate way it works. And just briefly, in biogeography, the study of species distributions parsimony is also used. There, it's used to infer ancient events like migrations or the splitting of populations by favoring the historical scenario that requires the fewest such major events to explain the patterns we see today.
Okay, biology is clearly a field where simplicity isn't always the answer, or at least needs careful handling. What about something that often seems to delve into the unobservable, like religion? Does Occam's razor have any relevance there?
It plays a surprisingly significant role, actually, particularly in philosophical discussions about the existence of God. William of Occam himself, despite being a deeply religious man and a theologian, believed that God's existence couldn't be definitively proven through logical reasoning alone. He felt that theological truths were primarily a matter of faith and divine revelation, not something to be established solely by philosophical argument or empirical evidence. So, for Occam himself, using his razor in a purely rational philosophical sense wouldn't necessarily lead one to dismiss God, because faith operated on a different kind of plane for him.
So for him, the existence of God wasn't really a question to be settled by philosophical parsimony in the first place.
Precisely. He saw it as fundamentally a matter of belief, informed by Scripture and religious experience. However, others have certainly applied a form of Occam's razor to the question over the centuries. Thomas Aquinas, as we mentioned earlier, even used a formulation of the principle in an objection to the existence of God in his Summa. He argued, essentially, that natural principles and human will could potentially explain everything we see in the world, making the hypothesis of God perhaps superfluous from a purely natural perspective. Of course, he then went on to offer his famous 5 ways, his own complex arguments for God's existence.
Right. And what about more contemporary perspectives on religion and Occam's razor?
Well, some theists might argue, somewhat like Occam perhaps, that their belief in God is fundamentally based on faith that transcends empirical evidence and purely rational analysis, making Occam's razor sort of irrelevant to their personal conviction. Kierkegaard's idea of a leap of faith kind of embodies this perspective. Conversely, many anti-theists or atheists argue that the very act of positing a God, especially a complex interventionist one, introduces a massive unnecessary layer of complexity into our explanations of the universe. Richard Dawkins's ultimate Boeing 747 gambit is a well-known example of this line of reasoning. It suggests that invoking a complex creator to explain complexity actually raises far more difficult questions like, Who created the creator? Then it answers. Going back a bit further, George Berkeley, the idealist philosopher, famously used a form of Occam's razor to argue against the existence of a material world independent of minds. He suggested that the existence of minds, ours and God's as the ultimate perceiver, is a simpler and sufficient explanation for all our perceptions, making physical matter an unnecessary entity.
Wow, that's a pretty radical application. Using simplicity to argue against, well, tables and chairs existing independently.
It certainly is. And then, of course, there's that well-known, though probably apocryphal, story about the mathematician and astronomer Laplace. He supposedly presented his work on celestial mechanics to Napoleon. When Napoleon allegedly asked why God wasn't mentioned anywhere in his theories explaining the solar system, Laplace is said to have replied, "Sire, I had no need of that hypothesis." Whether the story is true or not, it perfectly illustrates that scientific drive towards explanations that don't rely on unnecessary supernatural assumptions.
Okay, moving into the realm of the mind itself, how has Occam's razor been used in philosophy of mind? That seems like another area ripe for complexity.
It definitely has been used there. In the mid-20th century, the philosopher J.J.C. Smart famously deployed Occam's razor as a key argument in favor of the mind-brain identity theory over substance dualism. Dualism, in its various forms, posits that there are two fundamentally different kinds of stuff in the universe, physical matter and non-physical mind or spirit. Smart argued that identity theory, the claim that mental states like pain or thinking are simply identical to certain physical states or processes in the brain, offers a much simpler and more parsimonious explanation. It only requires one type of substance, the physical.
But did that argument definitively settle the infamous mind-body problem? Seems unlikely.
Far from it, no. Smart himself later nuanced his position quite a bit, and many other philosophers, like Paul Churchland, have argued that Occam's razor alone just isn't powerful enough to definitively resolve the deep mysteries of consciousness and the precise relationship between mind and brain. Similarly, the principle has been invoked, often quite controversially, to lend support to views like eliminative materialism or reductionism, the ideas that our everyday folk psychological understanding of the mind, beliefs, desires, etc., might eventually be completely replaced by a purely neuroscientific account. But again, it's a tool that sparks debate in this field rather than providing final answers.
Yeah, it seems like a recurring theme, doesn't it? While simplicity is often a good starting point, a useful guide, it rarely seems to provide the final knockout blow to really complex philosophical or scientific questions. What about in a completely different domain, like, say, penal ethics, punishment, and justice?
Interestingly, yes, the principle parsimony finds an application there too, though perhaps in a slightly different sense. In penal theory, parsimony refers to the idea of restraint in imposing punishment. It advocates for using the least severe penalty that is still necessary to achieve legitimate goals, like deterrence, retribution, or rehabilitation. The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham was a big proponent of a parsimony principle of punishment. He argued that any amount of pain or suffering inflicted beyond what's strictly required to achieve its intended purpose is basically unjust and wasteful. This idea is closely related to principles like proportionality in sentencing and is also a significant consideration in modern restorative justice approaches. So it's about not doing more harm, not adding more complexity or severity than is absolutely necessary to achieve a just outcome.
That's a really practical and, well, humane application of the idea of minimizing unnecessary additions, isn't it? Now, let's loop back quickly to probability theory and statistics. We touched on how Occam's razor gets formalized there. Can you give us just a bit more detail on that?
Certainly. As we mentioned, there are these links between Occam's razor and concepts like Kolmogorov complexity. At a high level, Kolmogorov complexity measures the complexity of something, like a string of data, by the length of the shortest computer program that can generate it. The idea is that simpler theories or models correspond to shorter, less complex programs in this abstract sense. More practically, Bayesian model comparison explicitly incorporates a preference for simpler models through something called the Occam factor. This essentially penalizes models for having more parameters or more complexity, unless that extra complexity provides a significantly better fit to the actual data. And tools like the Akaike Information Criterion, AIC, and the Bayesian Information Criterion, BIC, are everyday statistical tools that researchers use to embody this trade-off. They help balance a model's goodness of fit against its complexity, guiding researchers towards models that are both reasonably accurate and reasonably parsimonious. These are basically mathematical frameworks for quantifying and applying the principle of simplicity when analyzing data.
So these tools really help us mathematically decide when adding complexity to a model is actually worth the cost, so to speak.
Exactly. However, it's important to remember there's still an ongoing philosophical debate about whether simplicity itself is a completely objective property that we can universally measure, or if it inherently involves some degree of subjectivity based on, say, our chosen mathematical framework or even our prior beliefs about how the world works. There are other related principles, like the minimum message length, MML principle, which are attempts to provide perhaps a more objective information theoretic way to balance model complexity and how well it explains the observed data.
And are there any theoretical arguments suggesting Occam's razor might not always be the best guide, even from a mathematical or logical perspective?
Yes. The no free lunch theorems in the field of inductive inference and machine learning are quite relevant here. These theorems basically show, in a formal way, that no single inductive algorithm, including algorithms that implicitly or explicitly favor simplicity, is universally superior across all possible types of problems or all possible underlying realities. Any method, like Occam's razor, that performs well on one class of problems might perform poorly on another class. This suggests that the effectiveness of Occam's razor, at its most fundamental level, relies on certain implicit assumptions we make about the underlying structure and probabilities of the world we happen to be investigating. There's no universally guaranteed best way to make inferences without making some assumptions about the nature of reality itself.
That's a fascinating and, yeah, somewhat humbling thought that even this seemingly intuitive principle has these deep theoretical limitations. What about in more applied fields like, say, software development or artificial intelligence? Does the idea of simplicity play a role there too?
Absolutely, very much so. In software development, there's a well-known concept often called the rule of least power. This basically advocates for choosing the simplest programming language, framework, or technology that is still capable of effectively solving the problem at hand. Unnecessary complexity in software is generally seen as a bad thing. It can lead to more bugs, make the code harder to understand and maintain, and slow down the whole development process. Simpler is often better, more robust. And in artificial intelligence, particularly with deep neural networks, researchers have observed something interesting. Even though these networks can have millions or billions of parameters and seem incredibly complex, they often learn during the training process to represent the data using relatively simpler underlying mathematical functions than they theoretically could. This apparent tendency towards finding simpler solutions during learning might actually help these networks generalize better to new unseen data and avoid just memorizing the training data, which is overfitting.
So even in these really cutting-edge technological fields, the principle of favoring the simple, the efficient, the least complex solution that works, it still holds practical benefits. Now, we've covered a huge amount of ground here, the history, the justifications, the incredibly diverse applications. It also sounds like there are some pretty important controversial aspects and limitations to keep firmly in mind when we're thinking about wielding Occam's razor.
Definitely. One absolutely crucial point to reiterate is that Occam's razor is not a blanket prohibition against complex explanations or entities. It's not saying complexity is always wrong. Rather, it's primarily a tool for helping us make choices between competing theories that already have some reasonable degree of empirical support and that explain the available evidence more or less equally well. It can also be seen as a useful guide for prioritizing which hypotheses to investigate first. If you have a simple hypothesis and a complex one that both explain the data, it's often more efficient to test the simple one first. So it's as much about efficiency in our pursuit of knowledge as it is about the final explanation itself.
Right, so it helps us focus our efforts, maybe test the easier things first.
Precisely. Another really important consideration is that simplicity itself isn't always easy to define or measure objectively, as we touched upon. A theory might be considered simple in terms of the number of fundamental types of things it posits. That's ontological simplicity. But that same theory might be incredibly complex in its mathematical formulation or its structural relationships. Conversely, a theory with many different components might actually have a very simple, elegant underlying principle connecting them all. As we mentioned earlier, Galileo apparently even poked fun at the kind of simplistic reductionism that a crude, unthinking application of the principle might lead to. And as Francis Crick wisely pointed out in the context of biology, nature, shaped by evolution, doesn't always operate according to our human notions of elegance or engineering simplicity. Sometimes the evolved solution is messy and complicated for good historical reasons.
So it's definitely a tool that requires careful thought and nuanced application with a keen awareness of the specific context you're in. Are there any explicit anti-razors out there, like principles that actually argue against the idea of always preferring simplicity?
Oh, there are indeed. It's quite interesting. Walter Chatton, who was actually a contemporary and critic of Occam, formulated his own anti-razor. It basically went something like, if three things are not enough to verify an affirmative proposition about things, a fourth must be added, and so on. This is essentially a push in the completely opposite direction, suggesting that we shouldn't prematurely limit the number of potential explanatory factors needed to account for something. It sounds quite counterintuitive to our usual way of thinking, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, just keep adding things until it works.
Kind of. And Leibniz, with his philosophical concept of the principle of plenitude, the idea that the universe is as full and varied and rich as it possibly could be, also implicitly leaned against unnecessary simplification or reduction. Immanuel Kant offered a sort of counter-razor as well. The variety of beings should not rashly be diminished. Don't oversimplify reality. And the mathematician Carl Menger proposed what he called his law against miserliness, arguing that we shouldn't try to reduce the number of entities or concepts we use to the point where our explanations actually become inadequate or impoverished.
It's fascinating that there's this whole countercurrent to the dominant idea of simplicity.
It really highlights that the best or most fruitful approach isn't always obvious and probably depends a lot on our underlying assumptions about the nature of the world we're studying. Is it fundamentally simple or fundamentally complex and rich? There's also pataphysics, which is Alfred Jarry's playful science of imaginary solutions. That could be seen as the ultimate form of anti-reductionism, embracing the unique, the exceptional, the nonsensical, rather than seeking simple general laws. And in a more critical, maybe cynical vein, the physicist R.V. Jones coined something called Crabtree's bludgeon. This cynically suggests that one can always find a sufficiently convoluted and complex explanation to account for any set of observations, no matter how inconsistent or contradictory they seem. You can just keep adding complications. More recently, the physicist Igor Masinitz has even argued that in the highly competitive world of modern physics publishing, there might sometimes be an inverse Occam's razor at play, where simpler, more straightforward explanations are occasionally overlooked or undervalued in favor of more novel, complex, and perhaps eye-catching ones that are easier to publish in high-profile journals.
Wow, that's a surprising twist. The idea that complexity might sometimes actually be favored for, like, sociological reasons within science.
According to Mason's argument, yes, at least in certain contexts, novelty and complexity can sometimes outweigh simplicity in the quest for publication and recognition. Finally, just on a slightly lighter note, it's worth mentioning that The Skeptic magazine in the UK has been awarding the Occam Awards, playfully known as the Occam, since 2012. They give these awards to recognize significant contributions to skeptical inquiry, which, at its heart, is very much about applying critical thinking and, yes, often shaving away unnecessary assumptions and beliefs using a kind of conceptual razor.
That's a great way to bring it all together, actually. It shows that this ancient philosophical principle still has a very active and relevant presence in modern thought and practice.
Indeed. So yeah, to kind of bring our deep dive to a close here, Occam's razor is, at the end of the day, an incredibly valuable heuristic. It's a mental nudge, a guiding principle that encourages us to favor simpler explanations when we're faced with competing theories that seem to explain the available evidence roughly equally well.
And as we've seen throughout this conversation, it's definitely not just some dusty philosophical relic, is it? This principle, or variations of it, influences how we approach scientific inquiry, how we interpret biological phenomena, how we grapple with big theological questions, how we try to understand the mind, how we develop software, and even how we analyze data statistically. Its reach is really profound. Yeah.
Exactly. But and it's big, but it's absolutely crucial to remember the nuances and the limitations we've discussed. It is not an infallible rule or a magic wand. And the very definition of simple can itself be surprisingly complex and context-dependent. We really need to be mindful of the specific context in which we're applying it and always recognize that sometimes the underlying reality might just be complex. Forcing an overly simplistic explanation in those cases can actually lead us further from the truth, not closer to it.
Right. So for our final provocative thought for you, the listener, consider the last time you encountered multiple potential explanations for something in your own life or work. Did you instinctively gravitate toward the simplest one? Why? What underlying assumptions did that preference for simplicity rely on? And could a more complex explanation, maybe one that required a bit more thought but was still well supported by the facts you had, could that have offered a richer, perhaps more accurate understanding? The razor is a powerful tool for cutting through unnecessary clutter, absolutely. But maybe think of it as a starting point for deeper inquiry, not always the final cut.
Okay, you've tuned in, and today we're really diving deep into something huge in American culture, the Super Bowl.
Yeah, not just the scores, but the whole story behind it.
Exactly. We're going beyond the surface level.
Yeah.
And our main source, it's the Wikipedia entry on the Super Bowl. Surprisingly detailed, actually.
It really is. It covers, the origins, how it changed over time, the impact it has.
Right. So our mission here for you is to leave this with a proper grasp of the Super Bowl, how it began, those key moments, its, well, massive cultural footprint, and even, like, why some people call it the big game.
We want it to be insightful, yeah, but not overwhelming. Give you the core story.
Okay, then, let's jump in, the very beginning.
Yeah.
What actually sparked the idea for a Super Bowl?
Well, you got to look back at college football first. The whole bowl game tradition was already there, The Rose Bowl started way back, 1902.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that concept existed.
Yeah, that postseason championship idea, a bowl game. It was part of how people thought about football.
Gotcha. But then things got a little more interesting with the pros, right? With the AFL showing up.
Precisely. For a long time, the NFL was pretty much it for pro football. But then, 1960, the American Football League, the AFL, starts up.
And it wasn't just a minor league.
No, not at all. It was a serious competitor. They fought for players, fans, had a different style, maybe a bit more flashy. It created this real rivalry.
Okay, genuine challenger. So how does that rivalry lead to the Super Bowl itself?
Well, pretty quickly, actually, 1961, just a year in, the AFL commissioner, Joe Foss, he suggests a world playoff, NFL champ versus AFL champ.
The World Playoff. Ambitious. Did it happen right away?
No, not immediately. But the idea was out there. It planted that seed, an ultimate showdown.
Okay, so the seed is planted. What makes it grow into the Super Bowl we know?
Fast forward a few years, mid-60s, the two leagues are actually talking about merging. And that's when Lamar Hunt, he owned the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFL. He starts casually using the term Super Bowl. Funny story. He apparently said later it probably came from his kids playing with a toy called a Super Bowl.
Wait, a Super Bowl? Like the bouncy toy?
Yeah, he even kind of joked about it in a letter to the NFL commish, saying, we can probably come up with something better. They were tossing around names like AFL NFL Championship Game, Merger Bowl, just the game.
Ah, that's amazing. A toy leads to the name of this massive event.
Yeah.
So how did Super Bowl win out officially?
Well, the media just grabbed it almost instantly. Super Bowl. It sounded big. It was catchy. It fit the scale of the whole thing.
Yeah, it does have a ring to it.
And the public liked it. The players started saying it. So by the third game, it was official. Super Bowl III.
And the Roman numerals.
Yeah, those started with Super Bowl V.
Yeah.
Just to make it clear which season the game belonged to, since it's played after the season ends. Except for Super Bowl 50, they used regular numbers for that one. Kind of a one-off.
Okay, so we've got the name. What about those very first games? Were they like nail biters?
Well, the first two, technically the AFL-NFL World Championship games, they were both won by the Green Bay Packers. Vince Lombardi's Packers.
Oh, Lombardi. Legendary.
Absolutely. Those wins, plus their NFL titles before that, really cemented them as the team back then. And of course, that's why the trophy is the Vince Lombardi trophy.
Right, right. Named in his honor. But the AFL guys, they weren't just going to roll over, were they?
No way. And that leads to Super Bowl III, a huge moment. The AFL's New York Jets with Broadway Joe Namath at quarterback.
Namath, yeah, the guarantee.
Exactly. He guaranteed they'd win against the Baltimore Colts, the NFL champs, who were massive favorites. And they did it.
That must have sent shockwaves.
Oh, totally. It wasn't just an upset. It proved the AFL was for real.
Yeah.
Truly equal. It changed everything, really pushed the merger forward properly. And then the next year, the Chiefs won Super Bowl IV, beating the Vikings. So the AFL won the last two before the merger actually happened in 1970.
Wow, so those wins really set the stage. Okay, merger happens, RFC, NFC. How does the game change in the 70s?
For 70s, yeah. That decade saw some real powerhouses emerge. You had America's team, the Dallas Cowboys.
Right.
The Miami Dolphins, famously going undefeated one season.
A perfect season, yeah. Still the only one.
And the Pittsburgh Steelers, just an absolute dynasty, won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. Their steel curtain defense was legendary.
The steel curtain. Just sounds intimidating. What made them so good?
Oh, it's a ferocious front line, really disciplined play all around. They made it incredibly tough for anyone to score.
Okay, so 70s Steelers, Dolphins, Cowboys. Then the 80s and 90s. the script kind of flipped, didn't it? It felt like the NFC just couldn't lose for a while.
You're absolutely right. It was an incredible run for the NFC. 16 wins out of 20 Super Bowls in those 2 decades.
16 out of 20.
Yeah, including, get this, 13 wins in a row at one point.
13 straight. Wow. Who were the big players then?
Well, the 80s were largely defined by the San Francisco 49ers. Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, that connection was just magic. 4 titles for them.
Montana to Rice. Iconic.
Then the 90s, the Dallas Cowboys came back strong. Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin, the triplets. Another dynasty, 3 Super Bowls.
Okay.
But it wasn't just them. You had the 85 Bears, just utterly dominant that one year. The Washington team won a couple with different QBs, same for the New York Giants. Real depth in the NFC.
And spare a thought for the Buffalo Bills during all this.
Oh, man. 4 straight Super Bowl losses. Just brutal. A great team that just kept running into buzzsaws in the big game.
Heartbreaking. But like you said, things shift. The 2000s saw the AFC kind of fight back.
Fight back is putting it mildly. It was largely driven by one team, really. The New England Patriots.
Brady and Belichick. Yeah, that era.
Definitely. They just redefined consistency. Multiple wins in the early 2000s, became only the second team ever to win 3 in 4 years.
It's an incredible run.
But it wasn't only the Patriots for the AFC. The Steelers won again. The Colts got one with Peyton Manning. The Bucks won with Gruden. Oh, and how about the Giants beating the undefeated Patriots in Super Bowl XLTM?
Oh, that was unbelievable. Ruining the perfect season right at the end. A classic underdog story.
Definitely one for the ages. So yeah, the AFC was back.
Which brings us to the 2010s. Felt like more Patriots, but maybe a bit more balance overall, especially in the NFC.
That's a good way to put it. The Patriots were still there, making 5 Super Bowls in the decade. Remarkable.
5 appearances.
But the NFC title felt more wide open. You had the Ravens winning the Harbaugh Bowl against the 49ers.
Right, the brother versus brother coaching matchup.
The Seahawks won one, then lost one dramatically. The Broncos won with Peyton Manning riding off into the sunset.
Peyton's last game, yeah.
Then there was that insane Patriots comeback against the Falcons, down 28-3.
Still can't believe that happened.
Yeah,
28-3.
Historic. And the Eagles finally got their first win against the Patriots in Super Bowl up the side. We also saw the lowest scoring Super Bowl ever, Patriots winning that one too.
A real mix of games in that decade. And now, the 2020s. Feels like we might be seeing the start of another dynasty, Kansas City.
It certainly looks that way. Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs have been the team to beat. They won Super Bowl 11, lost one, then won LA. Just incredibly talented.
Mahomes is special.
For sure. But we also saw Tom Brady prove age is just a number, winning his 7th ring with Tampa Bay.
In their home stadium.
Right. First team to do that. And then, the very next year, the LA Rams did the same thing, won it at home in SoFi.
Crazy coincidence.
Then the Eagles made it back to Super Bowl LAX. Great game, but lost to the Chiefs, which set up this past year, Super Bowl LAX, where the Eagles actually got revenge and beat the Chiefs.
Stopping the three-peat.
Exactly. Prevented that historic three-peat. So yeah, lots of drama already this decade.
It's amazing how these storylines play out year after year. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The game itself is huge, but the broadcast, that's a whole other level.
Oh, absolutely. It's consistently one of the most watched TV events on the planet. Globally, only the UEFA Champions League final might get more eyes.
Really? Wow.
But in the U.S., forget about it. The 7 most watched television broadcasts in American history, all Super Bowls.
All 7? That's just mind-boggling. The audience size is immense.
Which is why those commercials cost so much money.
Ah, yes, the commercials. They're almost as big as the game for some people.
Totally. It's become its own cultural event. Companies pour money into making these ads memorable, funny, emotional. People talk about them for days.
And the networks rotate who gets to broadcast it, right?
Yeah, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, they cycle through. Though, interestingly, the very first one, Super Bowl I, was actually shown on both NBC and CBS at the same time.
Both? Huh. Didn't know that.
Yeah, kind of a unique situation back then before the full merger solidified things.
And what about the show after the Super Bowl? I hear that's prime real estate.
Oh, yeah. Massive lead-in audience. Networks use that spot to launch a new show or air a huge episode of an existing one. It's a massive opportunity for them.
Makes sense. You've got millions of people already tuned in. Okay, so TV's huge, ads are huge. What about the actual entertainment at the game? The halftime show, the ceremonies?
The halftime show, man, that's evolved incredibly. It used to be like college marching bands.
Right, very traditional.
Then came Michael Jackson in '93. That performance really changed the game, turned it into this massive pop culture spectacle, pulling in viewers who might not even care that much about the football.
MJ really set a new standard.
Definitely. Now it's always the biggest stars. Of course, sometimes there's controversy, like the Super Bowl XSA halftime show.
Yeah, the wardrobe malfunction. That definitely got people talking.
For sure. But beyond halftime, the pregame stuff is also pretty significant. The national anthem performances can be iconic. Whitney Houston's version is still maybe a gold standard for many.
Really, yeah, unforgettable.
They also do America the Beautiful, and more recently, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Plus, the coin toss, often with special guests. And you can't forget the postgame.
I'm going to Disney World.
Exactly. That campaign has become totally synonymous with winning the Super Bowl.
It really has. Okay, let's talk location. Where do they actually play these games? Seems like some cities get it more than others.
That's definitely true. Miami, New Orleans, Los Angeles, those areas have hosted the most by far. Warm weather helps, obviously.
Right. Is there a rule about needing an NFL team there?
Yep. You need an active NFL franchise in the region to host. And the stadium that's hosted the most, that's the Caesars Superdome in New Orleans.
Superdome. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And we mentioned the Bucks and Rams winning at home, which is super rare.
Extremely rare. Before them, no team had ever played a Super Bowl in their actual home stadium, let alone won it.
So usually it's warm weather or a dome. But there was that one cold weather outdoor game, wasn't there?
Yep. Super Bowl XL8, MetLife Stadium, New Jersey. Outdoors in February. There was a lot of talk about the weather beforehand, but the game itself went fine.
I remember that. And choosing these cities, it's not always straightforward, is it? Sometimes cities lose the game.
It has happened. The NFL has pulled the game from a city before. There was a controversy over Arizona not recognizing Martin Luther King Jr. Day back in the 90s. They lost it then.
Wow.
Other times it's been about stadium issues like in San Francisco or Kansas City years ago, or even a scheduling clash like with Mardi Gras in New Orleans one year.
So it's a big deal to get awarded the game. How do they decide?
The NFL team owners vote on it usually several years in advance. Cities put together these detailed bids showcasing their stadiums, hotels, infrastructure, all that stuff. Future host cities are already announced for the next few years.
A lot of planning involved. And, speaking of the name Super Bowl, the NFL's pretty protective of that term, aren't they?
Oh, incredibly protective. It's a valuable trademark. That's why you hear so many businesses or local TV stations talk about the big game or use other generic phrases if they aren't official sponsors.
The big game.
Right. They even tried to trademark the big game itself, but ran into opposition, especially from Stanford and Cal Berkeley, because their annual rivalry game has been called the big game for, ever.
Huh. Didn't work out then?
Nope. And then there's the whole Superb Owl thing online, people having fun getting around the trademark.
Superb Owl. Always makes me chuckle. Okay, one last quick thing. The home team designation, does it really mean anything in a neutral site game?
Well, it alternates year by year between the NFC and AFC champ. The main perk is they get to choose their jersey colored or white.
Okay, jersey choice. Is there any, advantage to one color?
Funnily enough, there's been a trend recently where teams wearing white jerseys have won more often than not. It's probably just a statistical quirk, but it's something people track.
Huh. Weird trend. Always something new to learn about this game. So wrapping this up, it's really incredible how this one event grew from basically a peace treaty between two leagues into this global phenomenon.
It really is. The journey from that first AFL-NFL championship to what it is today, it's packed with history, iconic moments, cultural shifts. It's more than just a game.
Absolutely. And hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has given you a much richer picture of the Super Bowl. Its roots, its evolution, the dynasties, the upsets, the whole spectacle surrounding it.
Yeah, it just shows how much there is beneath the surface, even for something we think we know well. Always more to uncover.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Looking ahead, there's talk about maybe playing a Super Bowl internationally someday. The way sports and media keep changing. What do you think the next 50 years might look like for the big game? Where could it go from here? Definitely something to think about. Okay, so when most of us think elves, we probably picture, pointy ears, forests, maybe Legolas, or Santa's little helpers.
Yeah, those are definitely the go-to images now.
But if you actually look back, the history of elves is, it's surprisingly long and really varied. Some genuinely weird twists in there.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the long, kind of winding path of the whole elf concept through history.
And we're using the big Wikipedia entry on elves as our guide for this.
That's right. It's pretty comprehensive, covers a huge amount of ground etymology, medieval stuff, folklore, even, high culture and global parallels. It's quite the resource.
Okay, let's get into this then, because the sheer amount of time and the range of what elves have been, it's kind of mind-blowing. We're
Right.
definitely not talking about just one thing here.
Not at all.
So our mission today, I guess, is to pull out the really fascinating bits from all this. What have elves meant, across different times, different cultures? Get a richer picture.
Precisely. Think of it as tracing the elf's transformations, how the idea morphed and adapted over centuries, mainly in Germanic cultures, but also touching on others.
Right. So with something this old, this widespread, where do we even start?
Well, the logical place is the word itself, elf.
Mhm.
The etymology, the origin of the word, can give us some clues about how they were first seen.
Okay, etymology. So the source says elf comes from Old English,
Hmm.
had relatives in Old Norse, Old High German.
Yep, Alf or Alp. Oh, they're all related.
And the main theory is it originally meant something like white being,
Yeah,
connected to Latin albuses, Greek alphas, white things.
that's the generally accepted view, yeah. White being.
Huh, white. What does that, imply? Good, bad, ghostly.
Well, that's the interesting bit. Initially, it might just be about appearance, maybe luminous, otherworldly, not necessarily good or evil.
Okay.
Jacob Grimm, the fairy tale guy, he thought it meant good, like light divinities. But more recent thinking leans towards maybe a matte white associated with beauty, especially female beauty.
So less shining bright and more just, visually striking, maybe linked to beauty standards of the time.
Possibly. It shows how we interpret even basic words through our own cultural lens, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there's that other idea mentioned, linking elf to the arpus in India, meaning skillful.
Ah, yes. That one's less accepted. The linguistic links are a bit, well, tenuous compared to the white being theory. Most scholars aren't convinced.
Seems like a bit of a long shot.
It does, but it reminds us that etymology isn't always straightforward. Lots of potential paths.
Now, the source also flags that elf turns up in loads of old names. Alfred, Elbridge, even Elgar.
Right. This is quite significant. You see elf used as the first part of personal names across medieval Germanic languages, and it's almost always positive.
So people were happily naming their kids elf something.
Exactly. Along with words for pagan gods, elf is one of the few supernatural terms used like this. It suggests they were seen positively, maybe even high status. You wouldn't call your child Elf Council if elves were purely demonic, right?
Good point. And not just people's names, place names too. Elvden, Elvenden,
Yeah.
linked with woods and valleys.
Yes, that reinforces the connection. Elves and the natural world, especially wilder places, may be seen as spirits of those locations.
Okay, so early days.
Yeah.
White, beautiful, maybe powerful, tied to nature. Generally seems okay, maybe even positive.
That's the initial picture, yeah.
But then we get to medieval England, and things seem to get darker, especially in those old medical texts. Elves causing illnesses, stabbing pains, mental problems.
Uh-huh. This is a really important shift. Texts like Bald's Leech Book explicitly name elves as causes for various ailments. It shows a more ambivalent, even dangerous side.
Makes you wonder what unexplained sicknesses they were blaming on elves.
Exactly. It's a way of giving a name and perhaps a perceived cause to suffering.
And this elf shot idea comes up. I always pictured tiny arrows.
Yeah, that's the common image, but the source is careful here. The Old English evidence for literal elf projectiles causing illness is actually, well, pretty thin. The word shot might just mean a sudden, sharp pain, like a shooting pain. It's later, especially in Scotland, that you get a clear link between elf shot and finding those Neolithic arrowheads.
Ah, so people found these ancient flint arrowheads and thought, elf weapons.
Pretty much. They became the physical proof of these harmful elf actions in later folklore.
That's wild. So the image of Anglo-Saxon elves,
Yeah.
it also changed, didn't it? They weren't always seen as like tiny demons.
No, not necessarily. Some older scholarship pushed that idea, but more recent views suggest they were probably seen as more human-like, maybe closer to the Irish AOC or the Norse elves.
Yeah, do we know that?
Well, for one, the Old English word for them, ilf, seems to be grammatically an ethnonym, a word for a group of people in Beowulf, like they were a distinct race or tribe.
Okay, like another group of beings, not just spirits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were even linked to beauty elfscon. Elf beautiful. It's used for biblical figures like Sarah and Judith.
Wow, that clashes quite a bit with the sickness-causing idea.
It does. It suggests a real complexity. But then, in Middle English, the darker side seems to become more prominent again. Seduction, stealing babies, the whole changeling thing.
Right, the fear of your baby being swapped for an elf child. That's creepy.
Very. So it's like the earlier ambiguity tilted more towards fear and suspicion as time went on.
So, a real journey.
Hmm.
Maybe neutral or good, then causing illness, then beautiful, then sinister kidnappers.
It's quite the evolution, and by the end of the medieval period in England, the word elf itself starts getting replaced.
By fairy, right. Chaucer uses them almost side by side.
Yeah, the French loanword fairy comes in and sort of takes over. The terminology shifts.
Okay, let's hop over the North Sea to Scandinavia. Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda talks about light elves and dark elves. Ljósálfar and Dökkálfar. Sounds neat.
It sounds neat, yeah, but the modern scholarly take is that this neat division probably owes more to Snorri trying to fit things into a Christian worldview. Angels and demons.
Oh, wow. So imposing a later structure onto older beliefs.
That's the thinking. The actual evidence from Old Norse poetry is maybe more revealing.
Like what?
Well, the phrase Aesir OK Elfar gods and elves pops up quite a bit. It suggests a really close connection, maybe even that they were considered almost the same category of beings sometimes.
Wow, so not minor spirits, but potentially on par with the gods.
It certainly implies a high status, much higher than Snorri's later division might suggest. The lines seem much blurrier in the older poetry. It challenges our neat little boxes for mythic beings.
Yeah, like two sides of the same coin almost.
Perhaps. And you also have the Alpha Blot, the sacrifice to the elves. That points to actual worship or ritual appeasement.
So they were important enough to get sacrifices.
Seems so. And the god Freyr is strongly associated with Alfheimr, the elf world. That's another strong link.
And the sun is called Elfdisk.
Alfrul.
Yeah, these poetic terms, these kennings as the type of metaphor they use, they really weave elves into the fabric of the cosmos. Calling the sun Elfdisk gives them a certain cosmic significance. But just like in England, there's a darker side too.
Oh, yes. The story of Völundr, or Waylon the Smith, who's explicitly called an elf in one source, involves a rape. That links elves to sexual danger, a theme that pops up again in later Scandinavian ballads.
So powerful, maybe divine, maybe beautiful, but also potentially dangerous and predatory. That duality again.
It's a constant theme, isn't it?
What about just everyday beliefs?
Yeah.
Do the sagas tell us much?
They don't feature elves heavily, not like gods or heroes, but the mentions we do get are revealing. Little glimpses.
Like what?
References to elves writing, the alpha blah again, even a sort of euphemism for going to the toilet, driving away the elves.
Seriously.
Apparently, it suggests elves were just sort of there in the background of everyday life and thought, even in a slightly mundane or humorous way.
And figures like Olafur Gyrsaelfr. Olafur the Elf of Gyrstair. He was a king who became an elf after death.
Well, he was worshipped after death and got that nickname. It blurs the lines between human, ancestor, and elf, and you have characters like Skuld, who was half-elven and skilled in magic.
So the boundary wasn't absolute. Humans could become elves or be related to them.
Exactly. And we can't forget the craftsmanship link with Völundr Wayland. Elves often seem to possess special skills.
Okay, moving across to Germany now. Medieval, early modern times. We get the Alp. Sounds different again.
Yeah, the old High German Alp seems mainly focused on being this eerie nature spirit, strongly linked to nightmares. The word Alpdruck means nightmare, literally elf oppression or elf pressure.
Ah, like sleep paralysis demons.
Very much that kind of idea. Also linked to illnesses like epilepsy. It feels much more consistently negative or frightening from the start compared to the early English or Norse ideas.
Less of a race and more of a specific kind of harmful spirit.
That seems to be the focus, yes. There's a Middle High German saying, the elves self are deceiving me, which links them to trickery, maybe seduction too. Echoes of other traditions there.
And it gets even worse later on. Demonic associations, witchcraft. Martin Luther thought his mother was tormented by one.
Yes, the association becomes increasingly negative. In prayers, they're depicted as threats linked to the devil and witchcraft. It's a definite downward slide in reputation.
And in Germany, they kind of got mixed up with dwarfs sometimes, like Alberich.
That's right. The name Alberich means elf powerful, but he's often seen as a dwarf king in later stories, so the categories could get fuzzy.
It's like each region took the basic elf idea and really ran with it in its own direction.
Absolutely. Which leads us into post-medieval folklore, where things get even more diverse.
So Britain after the Middle Ages, elf and fairy basically mean the same thing by then, often tiny creatures.
Largely, yes, especially in England. But in Scotland and the North, the older, perhaps more powerful ideas stuck around longer. You see it in the Scottish witchcraft trials. People like Isabel Gowdy confessed to meeting the Queen of Elfhame. And the folk ballads, Thomas the Rhymer, Tam Lin, are full of encounters with elves or fairies who are powerful, otherworldly, sometimes dangerous, abducting humans.
Right, those ballads have a real sense of danger, of crossing into another world, not just cute little sprites.
Definitely not. They preserve that older sense of the uncanny and the perilous.
And what about Scandinavia during this later period? Did the old Alfar stick around?
Well, the terminology gets complicated. Words related to Alfar exist, but other terms often become more common for these kinds of beings. In Sweden, you get the Elvor.
Elvor, what were they like?
The classic image is beautiful women living in hills or forests, often seen dancing in the mist. They're linked to elf dances, which could manifest as those mushroom rings or just circles of flattened grass.
Ah, the fairy rings. Classic folklore. And didn't they say time gets weird if you watch them dance?
That's a very common motif, yes. You watch for what seems like minutes, and years have passed in the human world. The elf realm has its own time.
But they weren't always young and gorgeous.
No, there's a story, Little Rosa and Long Lita, where the Elvigvina, the elf woman, is described as old but beautiful. So some variation there.
And the dangerous side persisted too. Seduction, luring people away.
Very much so. Scandinavian ballads like Elvskud, Elfshot, are full of stories about elves, often female, luring humans, sometimes fatally. It's a strong theme, just like in the British ballads.
And still causing illness.
Elmoblast.
Yes, elf puff or elf blast. They were blamed for sudden illnesses. And people had ways to try and appease or protect themselves.
Like those elf corner, little cut marks on rocks.
Exactly. People would leave offerings in them, maybe butter or something to keep the elves happy. And protective charms like the elf cores, the elf cross, all kind of pentagram were used against malevolent elves.
So these beliefs were really woven into daily life and how people dealt with misfortune. Absolutely. And remarkably, beliefs like the Holda folk, the Hitten people in Iceland, persist even today. You still hear stories about construction projects being delayed or changed to avoid disturbing places where they're believed to live.
That's incredible old folklore interacting with modern life.
It really is. Though, as the source notes, sometimes in modern folklore, the role of the supernatural other gets shifted onto, say, ethnic minorities, which is a more troubling reflection of societal anxieties.
Yeah, that's a sobering point about how these narratives can be repurposed.
It is.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. How did elves move from folklore into, well, high culture, literature, art?
Well, in England, the Elizabethans played a big role. Edmund Spenser in The Fairy Queen used fairy and elf for his human-sized allegorical characters.
Right, knights and ladies, not tiny sprites.
But then you get Shakespeare. A Midsummer Night's Dream is huge for popularizing the idea of elves as small, magical, maybe a bit mischievous nature spirits. Puck, Titania, Oberon.
Ah, yes. That really cemented an image, didn't it? Tiny winged, perhaps.
It certainly pushed things in that direction. That became a dominant literary image, moving away from the scarier folklore figures.
And then the Romantics got hold of them, particularly in Germany.
Yes. Interestingly, the English word elf, often in the form elf or elf, got borrowed back into German, though scholars like Jacob Grimm preferred the older German form Elb.
Language is messy.
It really is. And then there's the whole Erlkönig thing. Herder mistranslated a Danish word meaning elf as Erlkönig or Alder King. Goethe ran with it for his famous poem.
The one about the father riding through the night with his sick child, pursued by this sinister spirit.
That's the one. It created this very influential romantic image of the Earl King, a specific, malevolent, elf-like figure. Another layer added to the mix.
So many layers. And in 19th century Scandinavia, did they follow the English tiny elf trend?
To some extent, yes. You see elves adapted into small, sometimes insect-winged fairies, especially in children's literature. Hans Christian Andersen is a great example. He has those kinds of elvor, but he also wrote about the more dangerous traditional elver from folklore.
So he kind of had it both ways.
He reflected that tension. And by the Victorian era in Britain, you get that really familiar image solidifying. Tiny people, pointed ears, maybe stocking caps. Think the elves and the shoemaker.
Ah, yes. Though the original German story was about Wickelmänner, little men, not elfin, shows how the terms blurred.
Exactly. The names became interchangeable for these small, helpful beings.
And then Tolkien. He kind of blows up the Victorian image, doesn't he?
Completely. Tolkien went back to older sources, Norse and Anglo-Saxon, but heavily reimagined them. His elves in Middle-earth are tall, wise, beautiful, immortal, skilled, deeply connected to nature, often with those pointed ears.
He basically redefined elves from modern fantasy.
Undeniably, almost every fantasy elf sense owes something to Tolkien. His vision is incredibly powerful, and it's even influenced how some people identify in real life in certain subcultures.
That's quite an impact for one author. And we can't forget the other major modern elf.
Santa's helpers.
The Christmas elves. Where did they come from?
That's largely a 19th century American invention, influenced by poems like "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" and illustrations by Thomas Nast. They solidified into these small, often green-clad, industrious helpers at the North Pole.
A completely different branch of the elf family tree.
A very popular one, too. It just shows how adaptable the core idea is.
So we've seen elves in Germanic cultures. But the source mentions similar beings elsewhere, too. This isn't just a Northern European thing.
Not at all. You find parallels all over. Celtic traditions have the IOC or the Tylwyth Teg. Slavic folklore has the Vila. Finnish folklore has the Haltija.
And beyond Europe.
Oh, yeah. The Jin in the Middle East, Mrenkongvil in Cambodia, Encanto in the Philippines, Orang Bunyan in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Patupere in Maori tradition. Lots of cultures have beliefs in human-like supernatural beings living alongside us, often tied to nature, sometimes mischievous, sometimes dangerous.
It really does seem like a near-universal archetype, doesn't it? Some kind of other folk.
It certainly makes you wonder if it taps into something fundamental about how humans perceive the world and the unseen.
Okay, so final big question area. The relationship between these beliefs and, well, reality. For many people, these weren't just stories, right?
Absolutely crucial point. For long periods, belief in elves was a social reality. It shaped how people understood the world, illness, nature, misfortune.
And how did these beliefs fit in when Christianity spread? Did they just disappear?
Not usually, no. They often got integrated, but in different ways. Sometimes elves were explicitly identified with demons. We saw that in some Anglo-Saxon texts, later witchcraft trials, maybe Snorri's dark elves.
Okay, so demonized.
Sometimes. Other times they existed, sort of, alongside Christian cosmology. Like in the Icelandic Poetic Edda or those Scottish encounters, they weren't necessarily demons, just other beings.
Outside the main system?
Exactly. And sometimes they were integrated without being demons. There are Icelandic folktales that explain elves as, say, the hidden children of Eve, or as fallen angels who weren't bad enough for hell but not good enough for heaven. Ways of fitting them into the picture.
Clever ways to reconcile old beliefs with the new religion.
Very. It shows how persistent these ideas were.
Now, what about those later ideas trying to explain elves away? Like they were just memories of older indigenous tribes, or maybe inspired by people with genetic disorders.
Yeah, those theories were popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. The idea that elves were, say, folk memories of pre-Celtic peoples driven into hiding, or that conditions causing physical differences inspired elf descriptions.
But those theories don't really hold up.
Not really, no. There's little actual evidence for the hidden race idea. And while elf beliefs certainly interacted with how people understood illness or difference, we saw the link to causing sickness. And the word oaf might even derive from elf via the idea of changelings reducing the whole complex belief system just to those explanations is seen as an oversimplification by most scholars today.
Right. The belief seems much richer and more complicated than just a misremembered history or a metaphor for illness.
Exactly. Its power likely comes from its many facets.
Okay, so wrapping up this incredible tour through elf history.
I think the biggest takeaway is just how incredibly fluid and persistent the whole idea of the elf has been. It's like a shapeshifter, constantly adapting to different times, different places, different needs.
From white beings to gods to demons to sprites to Santa's helpers to Tolkien's heroes, it's covered a lot of ground.
An amazing amount.
So here's something for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. Given this huge range of roles we've seen, causing disease, being divine, tricking people, guarding nature, making toys, what deep-seated human needs or maybe desires do you think these elf beliefs actually reflect? Is it about explaining the things we don't understand? Or maybe personifying the forces of nature around us? Or is it about defining ourselves by defining who is not us, the other?
That's a great question.
Which of those ideas, or maybe another one entirely, resonates most with you after hearing all this, and why? Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over.